In 2011, Schalke walked into the San Siro to face the reigning champions of Europe, treble-winning Inter Milan. They were supposed to end their Champions League run without much difficulty. By the time the final whistle blew, the holders had been thrashed 5-2 in their own backyard, dismantled by a club that many believed would be dispatched with ease. For a moment, it looked as if Schalke had finally arrived, ready to claim a permanent seat among Europe's elite. 12 years later, the same club was in the second division, drowning in debt and forced to sell its best young players simply to keep the lights on. What happened in between wasn't just a collapse in results, but a slow unravelling of a club that had once been the pride of the Ruhr. This is the story of how one of Germany's most powerful and deeply rooted clubs rose to the edge of greatness and then lost control of its own future. This is the rise and fall of Schalke. In Gelsenkirchen, the phrase fallen giant carries a heavy meaning, because Schalke were never simply another Bundesliga name. They were one of the emotional centres of German football, a club whose identity is tied to factories, mines and terraces of the Ruhr, and whose sense of itself was shaped as much by near misses as triumphs. In 2010-11, it felt like a moment all of that history was finally being resolved. Schalke didn't slip quietly through the Champions League, they forced their way into it, playing with a confidence that surprised even their own supporters. Their victory over Inter Milan was not treated in Germany as a miracle. It was treated as proof that Schalke belonged on that stage after decades of believing they might. At the centre of that transformation stood Ralf Rangnick, a coach who'd spent much of his career being described as a theorist rather than a winner. In Gelsenkirchen, he became something more tangible. Rangnick organised Schalke into a side that combined modern gegenpressing with an old-fashioned sense of collective discipline. They weren't glamorous in the way that Bayern or Dortmund could be, but they were coherent, aggressive, and unusually brave for a club carrying so much historical anxiety. The team he built was a meeting point of generations. Manuel Neuer was already redefining what a goalkeeper could be, stepping beyond his penalty area with a calm that unsettled opponents. A young Joel Matip learned the game beside Benedikt Höwedes, while Julian Draxler, still a teenager, carried the creative hopes of the academy on his shoulders. Leading them was Raul, playing out the final great chapter of his career in a city built on coal rather than marble. For Schalke supporters, the symbolism was powerful. This was a club from the industrial heartland of Germany, taking its place among European royalty, without surrendering the traits that had always defined it. The Veltins Arena, with its retractable roof and sliding pitch, was often presented as a monument to modernity, yet the team inside it still played with an intensity and stubbornness of the old Ruhr. That run to the Champions League semi-final wasn't an isolated miracle. It sat on top of a deeper foundation, the UEFA Cup victory of '97, the greatest night in the club's post-war history. That triumph, secured on penalties against Inter Milan, gave Schalke a European legitimacy that domestic football had never quite provided. For years afterwards, the club lived inside the emotional glow of that success, convinced that another leap forward was always just around the corner. By 2011, it seemed that promise was finally being fulfilled. Schalke finished the season with a German Cup and a place among Europe's last four. The future looked bright. What few people noticed was how fragile the structure beneath that success had become. The wage bill was rising faster than revenues, coaching changes were already becoming routine, and the club's leadership was drifting away from the cautious, community-rooted model that had once protected it. From outside, Schalke appeared to be approaching a new golden era. From the inside, they were beginning to lose control of themselves. The same stadium that had roared through European nights would, within a decade, host second division football, and emergency meetings about survival. The distance between those two realities was shorter than anyone in Gelsenkirchen was prepared to imagine. To understand how far Schalke have fallen, it's necessary to remember how recently they still look secure. That Champions League run in 2011 was not followed by immediate decline. For several years, the club remained a permanent presence in the upper reaches of German football, sustained by a stadium that sold out every week and by a sense that their natural place was somewhere just behind Bayern Munich and Dortmund. The 2017-18 season appeared to confirm that belief. Under the young coach, Domenico Tedesco, Schalke finished second in the Bundesliga, above Dortmund, Leverkusen and Hoffenheim, who were being shaped by Julian Nagelsmann. The club returned to the Champions League, and even as league form began to waver, they still reached the knockout phase of Europe's most prestigious competition. On paper, Schalke looked like a stable, top-tier club, but beneath the surface, the picture was very different. The club had begun to live beyond its means. Budgets were increasingly built around revenues that weren't guaranteed, particularly the assumption of regular Champions League qualification. Recruitment became more speculative, wages climbed, and decisions that would have once been measured through the lens of their cautious culture were now shaped by a desire to keep pace with richer rivals. The transfer of Briel Mbolo in 2016 captured that shift in mentality. Schalke presented the signing as a statement of intent, announcing they'd prevailed over Barcelona, Manchester United and Arsenal to secure one of Europe's most coveted teenagers. The message to supporters was clear. Schalke were now competing at the same table as the continental giants. 3 years later, Mbolo was sold to Borussia Mönchengladbach for roughly half his original fee, after a career in Gelsenkirchen interrupted by injuries and inconsistency. What had been sold as a symbol of ambition quickly became a reminder of how fragile it could be. Similar stories followed. Nabil Bentaleb arrived from Tottenham in 2017 for a substantial fee, and left without a transfer return at the end of his contract. At the same time, players who should have represented the club's economic backbone were allowed to drift away. Leon Goretzka, Sead Kolasinac, Max Meyer and Joel Matip, all either academy products or long-term investments, departed on free transfers, depriving Schalke of the income that might have stabilised their accounts. The problem wasn't a single mistake, but a pattern in which sporting planning and financial logic no longer aligned. These choices were enabled by the figure who dominated Schalke for almost 2 decades, Clemens Tönnies. The billionaire owner of a vast meat processing empire had served as chairman since 2001, and repeatedly covered shortfalls with his personal loans. For years, this model was treated as evidence of stability. In reality, it was disguising how dependent the club had become on one man's willingness to underwrite risk. When he stepped down in 2020 after a series of controversies and a COVID outbreak at his company, the protective layer he provided disappeared overnight. What remained was a balance sheet carrying debts of more than 200 million euros, and a club structure that had forgotten how to live within its means. Supporters have been encouraged to believe that Schalke were moving naturally towards the European elite, but instead they've been drifting towards a cliff edge, sustained by credit and optimism rather than a coherent plan. The false dawn of the Tedesco years was therefore not a revival at all, but the final bright reflection of a system already beginning to fail. The strangest season in Schalke's modern history began with something close to hope. When David Wagner arrived in the summer of 2019, he didn't look like an emergency appointment. He was a former Schalke player, a member of the '97 UEFA Cup winning squad, and a coach whose reputation had been shaped in England, where he'd carried Huddersfield Town into the Premier League and kept them there against all the odds. He spoke the language of intensity and togetherness that Schalke supporters recognise, and his return felt less like a gamble and more of a homecoming. For half a season, that feeling appeared justified. By mid-January 2020, Schalke had lost only 3 Bundesliga matches. They were organised, energetic and effective. After a 2-0 win over Borussia Mönchengladbach, the club climbed to 5th place, level on points with Borussia Dortmund and within touching distance of the summit. The Veltins arena, still full and still loud, began to imagine Champions League football returning. Wagner's ideas seemed to fit the squad, and the squad appeared to believe in him. Then, almost without warning, the floor disappeared. That win over Mönchengladbach became a line in the club's history that no one could have predicted. For the next 358 days, Schalke wouldn't win another league game. Between January and the end of June, they scored only 9 goals. A collapse so sudden that even the players struggled to explain it. The interruption of the pandemic obscured the scale at first, but when football returned, the decline accelerated rather than eased. Confidence drained from the side, and matches that had once felt controllable began to slip away. What had looked like a coherent project in winter felt like a team that had forgotten how to play together by spring. Inside the stadium, the mood changed just as quickly. Supporters who'd embraced Wagner as one of their own started to question his methods. Training sessions were described as repetitive and the squad was exhausted. The club's leadership was hesitant. Many assumed the summer of 2020 would bring change, a chance to reset before the damage became permanent. The decision to keep Wagner in place would prove one of the most consequential in Schalke's history. When the new season began, the old problems returned immediately, only magnified. The long winless run followed the team into autumn, turning anxiety into panic. What had started as a poor sequence now felt like a loss of identity. Players stopped looking like individuals in bad form and began to resemble a group that no longer believed in the structure around them. Schalke had experienced difficult years before, but nothing like this. The club that had stood level with Bayern in January, by the end of the year were staring directly at relegation, the kind of decline that happens when confidence leaves a building one small defeat at a time. Schalke were already a club living on borrowed time. Wagner had survived 6 months without a league victory, when the new campaign opened with 2 defeats and 11 goals conceded, including an 8-0 dismantling by Bayern Munich. Wagner was dismissed. What followed wasn't a recovery but a carousel. Schalke appointed Manuel Baum and turned to Christian Gross, then to Dimitros Gramotzis, with Hub Stevens stepping in briefly as a caretaker between the fires. 5 different voices tried to speak to the same confused squad. Each arrived with different ideas of how Schalke could play, and each discovered how little space there was left for ideas to breathe. Formations changed from week to week, leadership changed almost as often, and nothing settled long enough to become a direction. The players felt that instability in their legs as much as in their heads. A team that had once prided itself on discipline began to leak goals in ways that looked almost inevitable. Matches followed a similar pattern, promising starts, a single setback, and then a slow surrender that no tactical adjustment could halt. Behind closed doors, without the noise of the Veltins arena to carry them, Schalke looked exposed. The stadium that had always been a source of strength became an echo chamber. Opponents no longer feared travelling to Gelsenkirchen, and Schalke no longer expected to win there. The club's identity had been built on intensity, but the intensity is difficult to manufacture in silence. Goals became rare and the team created little from open play. At the other end, the numbers were brutal, 86 goals conceded across the season. By spring, the question was no longer whether relegation could be avoided, but how the club would survive it. On the 20th of April 2021, a 1-0 home defeat to Arminia Bielefeld confirmed what everyone had feared for months. Schalke were going down. The final tally of 16 points was the lowest in the club's modern history, and one of the worst records the Bundesliga had ever seen. Outside the stadium, anger spilt into the streets as supporters confronted players and officials, demanding explanations. The scenes were raw, not because Schalke had been relegated, but because it felt as if something larger had been broken. Financial reality soon followed sporting failure, with matchday revenues devastated by the pandemic and debts already climbing. The club faced a genuine prospect of insolvency. Sponsors reconsidered their commitments, and the dependence on external backers, particularly Gazprom, became an uncomfortable political question as well as an economic one. Schalke were not simply dropping into the second division, they were entering it without any clear idea of how to climb back. The relegation was a moment when years of misjudged decisions and delayed reforms finally converged. A club that had once believed itself too big to fail discovered how fragile size can be when the structure disappears. Relegation is often described as a reset, but more commonly it's a slow disappearance. Clubs that fall out of the top division rarely return with the same identity, and many never return at all. Schalke entered that world in the summer of 2021, carrying debts, wounded pride, and a squad that was already breaking apart. Key players departed, the budget was cut sharply, and Dimitros Gramotzis, the coach who'd overseen the final months of the collapse, was asked to rebuild the team from the fragments. Results were uneven and performances cautious, and by early March the promotion push appeared to be drifting away. The club dismissed Gramotzis and turned to a familiar face. Mike Burskins, a man whose relationship with Schalke stretched back to the terraces and the '97 UEFA Cup triumph. What followed was not a revolution but a rediscovery. Burskins simplified the team, leaned on experience and reconnected the squad with the qualities that had once defined them. The side played with width and delivered crosses early, and trusted the physical presence of Simon Terodde, whose arrival from Stuttgart proved decisive. Terodde scored with a regularity of a striker who understood the division better than anyone, finishing the season with 30 goals and becoming the emotional centre of the campaign. Gradually, the Veltins arena remembered how to feel like itself. Crowds returned, and with them a sense that Schalke was still capable of carrying the weight of expectation, rather than being crushed by it. The team pressed higher and defended with more courage, and began to win matches in a chaotic, breathless style. The decisive moment arrived in early May against St. Pauli. Schalke trailed by 2 goals, with the season slipping towards another year outside the Bundesliga. They scored once and then again, and finally a third. turning despair into celebration in the space of half an hour. A week later, the club were crowned champions of the Bundesliga too, their first trophy in more than a decade. On the surface, it looked like a fairy tale. The club had risen back at their first attempt. Yet even on that day of promotion, there were quieter doubts. The return to the Bundesliga felt like a rescue rather than a renewal, a brief clearing in a storm. For a moment, hope was allowed to breathe again in Gelsenkirchen. Promotion was supposed to be a beginning, not a pause. When Schalke returned to the Bundesliga in the summer of 2022, the club spoke the language of survival rather than ambition. Mike Burskins, the hero of promotion, stepped back into the background and the board turned to Frank Kramer. He'd just been relegated but was chosen to guide one of Germany's most volatile institutions through its most fragile moment. For the first weeks, it was clear how thin the margin would be. By mid-October, Schalke stood second from bottom, and Kramer had become the sixth manager to lose his job in just 2 years. The footballer had been cautious to the point of paralysis. Thomas Reis replaced him, another coach with Bundesliga experience. He tried to give the side more courage, but the underlying problems remained. Schalke struggled to create chances, and when they did, they lacked the confidence to finish them. Across the entire campaign, Schalke scored only 35 goals. And off the pitch, the ground was shifting again. The Russian invasion of Ukraine in February 22 had forced Schalke to sever their relationship with Gazprom, the sponsor that had underwritten so much of the club's modern identity. The central pillar of revenue disappeared. Years of short-term thinking now demanded payment. Transfer mistakes, managerial compensation, a culture of constant change. By the spring of 2023, Schalke were relegated again, only a year after their triumphant return. The bounce had not been a revival, it had been a brief interruption in a longer descent. The club that had once terrified Europe was now trapped in a cycle of rescue missions, each one weaker than the last. If Schalke were measured only by league tables, the story would already be finished. Yet this club has never been defined solely by position or trophies, and in Gelsenkirchen, football has always carried a meaning that stretches far beyond the pitch. It should feel diminished, but when Schalke travel, the stands are full, the noise familiar, and the sense of belonging is unchanged. Their average attendance still rises above 60,000, higher than almost every club in Europe outside a small circle. That loyalty isn't the product of success, it survives in spite of failure. Away matches have become pilgrimages. Tens of thousands apply for tickets to stadiums that could not hold half of them. The culture has kept the club alive while almost everything else weakened. The academy remains Schalke's most honest legacy, guiding Ozil, Neuer, Sane and Draxler into professional football. While neighbours in Dortmund are celebrated for recruiting prodigies from across Europe, Schalke have continued to produce their own. Even the present revival carries an unexpected accent. Miron Muslic arrived from Plymouth Argyle with little reputation in Germany, and few promises beyond hard work. Within months, the same squad that had drifted through a miserable campaign began to show a different temperament. Loris Karius, whose career once seemed defined by a single disastrous night, has found a second life behind that backline, and each clean sheet has felt like a small act of redemption. The danger, however, has not vanished. Schalke carry debts that would trouble clubs twice their size, and the German football authorities have granted only conditional licenses while a significant liquidity gap must be bridged. In Gelsenkirchen, the club is not an accessory to life, but part of its structure, and that relationship has endured every humiliation the modern game has delivered. Before 2022, Schalke supporters had not known relegation for more than 30 years. An entire generation had grown up believing the Bundesliga was a birthright, and now the club sits in the lower half of the second tier, its future discussed less in terms of ambition than survival. The idea of stability has become a distant hope. Football teaches its cruelest lessons slowly. Clubs convince themselves that size is protection, that history functions as a safety net, and then discover that the modern game has no memory at all. Schalke learned that truth later than some, but more brutally than most. The club that once intimidated Europe now measures success in licenses granted and debts postponed. Schalke's story is a warning written in blue and white. It shows how quickly a powerhouse can be reduced to fragility through careless recruitment and financial dependence. Yet it's also something more stubborn than a cautionary tale. In Gelsenkirchen, the club has never belonged only to boardrooms. It belongs to streets shaped by minds, to supporters who travel in numbers that defy the division printed on the ticket. Whether Schalke return to the Bundesliga soon or wander longer through the wilderness, that bond will outlive any table. Football can take trophies, reputations, and even professional status, but it can't erase the things that were built over generations. The game may have changed beyond recognition, yet in the Ruhr, there remains a club that refuses to accept the role of relic. And perhaps that's the final truth of Schalke. Giants don't disappear when they fall. They simply learn how to stand again in a different light. If you enjoyed this story about Schalke, check out some of the other videos on my channel, including Hamburg and Kaiserslautern. If you enjoy some of the stories that we tell on the channel, then be sure to check out the range of infographics available in the description below. What are your memories of these great Schalke sides? Let us know in the comments below. And in the meantime, stay tuned for more football history, one incredible story at a time.